Okay, so we're going to I'm going to try and cover all bases-ish today. Obviously, you can't talk about everything in sort of half an hour, but I just want to give a brief overview, a little bit to do with equipment, a little bit to do with your settings, a little bit to do with creative sort of shooting as well. For my personal video shooting, I don't know how many of you really know what I do outside of Michael's, but my freelance work is artwork documentation. So I photograph and video things in galleries for artists, video performances, shoot performances, all that sort of thing. So I will hopefully at the end have some time to show you just a couple of videos that I've made. They will be of my work, not my client's work, because I wasn't really sure if they would like me showing them here. But it'll give you, there are some things that we'll talk about that'll be relevant in those videos as well, and I'll just sort of walk you through, I guess, a bit of my methodology for when I shoot video for work, as opposed to doing something, I guess, that's sort of creatively inclined. So let's start with the cameras, I guess, because they're sort of like the thing that we need to shoot video. Who has a camcorder in here? A few people, yeah. Who has like a DSLR or mirrorless camera? Lots of you. DSLRs or mirrorless are definitely in the more popular direction that things are going, mainly because of their versatility. They're sort of a bit of a jack of all trades, you know, they do a bit of this and that. Is anyone thinking of getting a video camera and sort of on the fence, or is wanting to transition from photography to video? No one? Yeah, one person, all right, beautiful. So
maybe a GoPro or something.
GoPros, well, that's something altogether. We won't be really covering much to do with GoPros today, but it is interesting how, you know, there are all these sort of niches that sit within these larger genres of photography and video, and things like GoPros, you know, do one thing very, very well, and that's sort of capture point of view action shots. Like, they're exactly what you want for that sort of thing. But just to broadly talk about the two categories of video cameras that are sort of relevant to the current day and age, we've got interchangeable lens systems and camcorders. All right? So interchangeable lens systems are things like your DSLRs and your mirrorless cameras. You can take the lens off, you can swap it out, and you can put a new lens on. Camcorders are normally all sort of fixed together, so you've got one system, it sort of does a bit of everything. Now, there is a trade-off to that. With camcorders, you generally have smaller sensor sizes than something to do with an interchangeable lens, and the trade-off with a small sensor size is generally a diminished image quality, okay? So you will get better image quality all around on an interchangeable lens system. The problem with an interchangeable lens system is that they're generally inflexible compared to a camcorder. So a camcorder, you get huge zoom ranges. We're talking like 10, 20, 30 times zoom. You'd never find something like that on an interchangeable lens system, and if you found something close, the lens would be sort of like this big. So they're very impractical for doing that sort of filming, where if you need to get to the other side of a footy field, or you're trying to video something that's on the other side of a lake, you know, something a long way away, it's quite hard to do that with an interchangeable lens system. The good thing about interchangeable lens systems, and the reason why I shoot my video with, I shoot with a Sony mirrorless, is because it's flexible in the sense that I can shoot stills and video at the same time without having to muck around with two different cameras. And quite often when I am shooting a job, I need to be doing both. Someone doesn't hire me just to do video or just to do stills, they want a selection of both of those things. If I had to use a camcorder, then it'd be sort of impractical to pick that up, video with it, pick up the stills camera, shoot with that. But there are definite benefits to camcorders, and particularly when you start to invest a lot of money into them. So if you buy the very high-end camcorders, you do actually start to get ones which you can swap the lenses over. We're sort of talking about the $5,000 range or beyond though here, so they are quite expensive to get into. And the camcorders often have better control over audio as well. So you do actually have some ways of adjusting and modifying the audio with the camcorder. The high-end ones often have things like XLR inputs in them, which is a balanced kind of audio, and give you a cleaner audio sound than what you'll get with the standard 3.5mm audio jack in an interchangeable lens system. Both have pros and cons. There's no real right or wrong. If you are looking at getting a system though, it's important to realize what exactly you're looking for and which system's going to work better for you. All right, So let's talk a bit about audio, because audio is half the sort of battle when it comes to video. People often say that you can get away with bad video, but you can't get away with bad audio. We tend to tune out from bad audio quite quickly as human beings. I'm not going to go too much into detail. Audio is its own kettle of fish, so we could do a whole seminar on audio. We could do a whole class on audio quite easily. But I want to give you a few little tips. Now, the first tip is to get the microphone as close as you can to your subject. That's the case whenever you're recording audio, all right? So you know when you see like film productions and they've got the big boom mic hanging over people doing dialogue? That's because they're trying to get that audio as close to the actors as they can. The closer they get it, the cleaner the audio sound will be, and the less sort of background noise that they'll capture. So anyone heard of the inverse square law in photography? Yeah, if you've used lights before. The same principle applies to audio. So inverse square law applies to audio as well. And what the inverse square law says is that if you double the distance that audio needs to travel, you're losing 75% of the sound, all right? So you can imagine what the difference between 1 meter and 2 meter and then 4 meters, it's incredible how much that audio drops off. Getting the audio device as close to the subject as possible makes a huge difference. The other thing you want to do is reduce as much background noise as possible, all right? So electronic appliances are classic, they all hum. And this projector, for example, is a good example because if everyone was quiet and I wasn't saying anything, we'd be able to hear this thing whirring in the room. And if you've got that in the background and on top of what other people are trying to talk, or if you're trying to capture just ambient noise, you'll hear this sort of buzzing and whirring. It's not very nice. You want to try and turn off all electronic appliances if you can. Another good tip too is to actually wear headphones when you're recording. So most cameras will have a headphone jack, so you can plug headphones into them, put them into your ears, and you're hearing exactly what the camera's hearing. And you want to be doing that because the camera's going to be hearing audio differently based on how the mics are set up to you just sort of standing in the room with the actors, or if you're out filming a sports game or whatever. And the last thing I want to say is to make sure you don't clip your audio. So has anyone heard of the term clipping when it comes to photography, like your exposures? Clipping's when you blow your highlights out and you end up with pure white. You don't want to do that. It's always a huge no-no. And it's the same with audio too. You never want to clip your audio, because if you clip, you've lost data and you can never get that back. And it's much, much harder to recover or do anything with audio that's being clipped. The way that you can tell if it's clipping is generally when you film on a camera or shoot with video, there'll be a little audio levels sort of bar on the bottom that'll go up and down as audio is picked up. And if it hits the red, which is all the way on the right-hand side, it's like the danger zone, you know? Red means danger. Don't get into the red. Okay, so what are some kinds of audio systems? There are a couple of systems. There's single systems and double systems. I'm just going to talk about single systems today, all right? Just to quickly give you the difference, a single system is one that you plug into the camera so that the audio is actually recorded alongside with the video file. A double system is where you're recording the audio separately from the video using some sort of external recording device, and then you're syncing them up later in post. All right, so a double system often gives you much more control. The higher end microphones are generally separate from the video cameras, and you can get them nice and close by physically putting them close to your subject as well. But you do have to go a little bit further and do a bit more extra work, syncing those things up. Anyone seen the classic Hollywood, you got the clapperboard where it goes like that at the start? That's to sync your audio and your video. So when that thing spikes in the audio, when you see it close in the video, you know that that's how you measure those two, or match those two up together. Common single systems in what we're doing though are lav mics and directional mics, okay? So for example, I'm wearing a lav mic now, both to project audio through the speakers in the room and also to send audio to that video camera at the back of the room as well. Now, lav mics are good because I've already said, right, you want to get your microphone as close as possible to your subject, and a lav mic's the best way of doing that. It's right near me. There's no sort of way that the audio is going to travel over a distance and fall off and possibly get mixed with any other noise in the room. You're going to get a nice, clean, crisp signal. That's why you see these used a lot in interviews on TV or the news, stuff like that, because the audio is very important to get the story across. The drawback to lavs is that it's not super sightly. Like, you couldn't imagine using this if you were shooting a film and you were trying to get actors to do some dialogue, because I got this big silver thing hanging off my shirt. Not such a good look. You can get more subtle ones, and you can sort of hide them, like tuck them under shirts and things like that to sort of keep them out of the way. But the problem is that when you get them underneath closing, you get a rustling like that. And you can, that's next to impossible to get out of your audio file. If you try and remove this from an audio file while I'm talking, good luck. It's not going to happen. The solution to that is not to have your microphone on the person, but to have a directional mic instead. And that's one that you place on top of the camera generally in a hot shoe, and it records audio from where you're pointing the camera towards. They're good because they're nice and easy. I use a directional mic normally when I shoot because it means that I can change scenes, shoot different people, and I don't need to go around setting up new mic systems on all of them. I can just move around very quickly. But the same principle applies. You still want to get as close as you can to the person, because imagine, if this is 100% that a lav mic's picking up as far as audio levels are concerned, by the time you get 5 meters away, we're talking about fractions of a % difference in actual audio levels, huge drop off. They are designed to sort of take the stuff that's coming in front of them and try and ignore the stuff to the side. And you can get different variations of directional microphones, ones that'll have a finer degree of audio and ones that'll have a wider degree. It just depends on which one you get. Okay, so that's all we're going to talk about as far as audio goes, but we could go on about that forever. The next thing we're going to talk about is stable shots. Generally, when we're filming video, we want stable shots. The only exception to that rule is if you're trying to go for, if you're shooting documentaries, sometimes you'll see a bit of camera shake. It gives it a bit more of an honest, authentic feel. Or if you see Jason Bourne fight scene or something like that, the camera's shaking all over the place like this because it makes it feel like you're part of the action. But I would say 90% of the time, you're wanting to keep your shots nice and stable. It's pretty hard to watch shaky footage, particularly over a long video. So, how do you do that when you're hand holding? Now, hand holding is always the trickiest, right? Same with stills photography. It's much easier to get a stable shot if you've got your camera on a tripod. But quite often when you're shooting video, you want to be flexible. You want to be moving around, and you don't want to be carrying your tripod, setting it up all over the place, and not, again, just to get stable shots. Now, first one I have there is fluid movements, and I sort of think of this as you've got to be very zen about your movements when it comes to video. Think of yourself as water sort of flowing over the rocks, not barging through them. And I imagine I'm doing like Tai Chi when I'm moving around with a video camera. I want to be nice and considered with my movements. I don't want to jerk, I want to sort of move nice and slowly, nice and evenly. You don't want to be sort of thrashing the camera around like this. It's very difficult to watch. And I've found you can never really move too slowly when it comes to doing things like pans and tilts, all right? It's easy to move too quickly, but it's quite hard to move nice and slow. Second thing is points of contacts. Same sort of ideas as still photography, all right? We want to create more points of contact between us and the camera, and that way we'll keep the thing more stable. Now, the first two are your two hands, okay? So you don't want to be trying to film video like this here. You'll find it impossible to keep it still. You want to use your left hand, make a cup, right hand comes over on the grip, and you hold it with two hands there. Generally, when you're using a system like this or a camcorder, you've got the screen away from your face. Sometimes you might want to put the viewfinder up to your eye, but it can be a little bit restrictive to sort of the movements you can do because you can't move your arms and your body so much doing that. If you do put it up to your eye though, that's another point of contact, and you'll keep it more still like this here than you will out here. Now, so what's the solution if you want to hold your camera out like this, look at the back of the screen, but you want to have a third point of contact? That's using this thing, the camera strap. Normally I hate these things. I never ever use one unless I'm shooting video because I find they get in the way. But what you can do is actually put your camera strap around your neck and create a bit of tension between the strap, the camera and your neck, and then this becomes your third point of contact. And these are really useful because you can use these as a pivot point as well. So if you're doing tilts or you're doing pans, you can move that there and you're rotating on this point rather than just trying to hold the camera at the same distance away from you as you move around. Someone told me this trick only quite recently, about a year ago, and it changed my life when it came to video. Use your strap. It makes a huge, huge difference. The other thing is to use your pivot points as well. So rather than trying to just move arms up and down, if you've got your strap and you sort of bend over, I find I can get smoother motion with that too. And also, like, rather than swinging my arms around like this, pivoting on my hips. So like that there allows me to get much smoother, consistent motion than actually just swinging my arms around. Using the pivot points in your body in order to pivot and move and control your camera movements. Using wide focal lengths makes a huge difference too. So those of you who are sports or birds photographers might know that when you put a 600mm lens on a camera, it's incredibly hard to hold it steady. All your movements are exaggerated by, I don't know, exponentially when you start to put a huge telephoto lens on it. So if you can shoot wide, you reduce the effect of camera shake. Now, there is a trade-off to that because you do get distortion at wide angles, and sometimes you might want the compression effect that you get shooting telephoto. But if you've got the choice of shooting wider and moving closer to your subject, you'll get much more stable handheld shots that way too. Image stabilization makes a big difference. So lots of cameras these days, including camcorders, DSLRs, mirrorless, have some sort of image stabilization in them. And there's no reason not to use that when you're shooting video. It's amazing what the difference between your footage with it turned off and your footage with it turned on will be like. It's sort of like a little inbuilt gimbal gyro system in your camera. Make the most of it. You want to lock in your settings before you start shooting as well. So you don't want to start shooting and then realize you've got to change your shutter speed or your aperture, or you've got to press a button, because as soon as you press something, you're shifting the camera around. You want to get yourself set up, get yourself organized, start filming, record your shot, and then if you find that you need to change some sort of setting, I find it's best to just cut the shot, change your setting, and then start again, and put them together later in post. The last thing too, shouldn't have put this down, is if you do need to move. So all these things we've talked about so far have sort of been if you're standing still. But if you need to move, that's always the trickiest, right? Because when I move, my jolt up and down as my feet hit the ground. So what you want to do is keep your legs bent, and you do sort of look a bit stupid, but you want to come down like this and use your knees as natural suspension, okay? So rather than moving like this here, camera bounces up and down with each step. If I just gently sort of go backwards, use my legs as suspension, then you don't get that jerking sort of effect. It's still hard to keep the camera nice and smooth when you're doing that, but it'll be a better result. Now, as far as equipment goes, so there are heaps of things you can buy for video, for doing different sort of transitions and camera movements. First one is tripods. Who came to the seminar last week? A few of you? Yeah, so you would have seen they had like a U-Butte video tripod. You can get more basic ones than that too, but you really want a nice pair of stable legs. And the thing that I find is the most important and the biggest difference between a video and a stills head is this thing here, this big handle, right? You only ever see these on video tripods. And that's because it's much easier to get nice, still, fluid movements when you've got a bit of distance between the camera and your hand. It's much easier to evenly guide that around than it is if I was trying to hold the camera body and move it like that on something like a ball head or a short three-way head. Things like sliders too. So they're these. I love playing with the video toys. They're so fun. This thing here is like, you know, those nice smooth shots where it shifts from side to side. That's using some sort of slider device. And these are like a smaller version of a dolly. Has anyone heard the term dolly before? Yeah, a few of you. So that's a big sort of setup on wheels that you wheel around the place. This here gives you that dolly effect, but it's a little bit more practical. And after the lecture, come up and have a play around with this, because it's pretty nice, that nice smooth transition of footage you get using something like this here. Last thing is gimbals. Anyone used one of these before? I love these things. I'll show you this at the end too if we've got time, because it's pretty magic how these work. And these are incredibly popular now, because what these are is a motorized head. You put your camera on here and it sits there like that. And then as I do movements, the motor in the head keeps that camera nice and still. And pretty much every sort of like indie film production or videographer doing weddings, you know, shooting events, that sort of thing, will be using one of these to get nice smooth footage, because they're relatively small, but they make a huge difference. It's actually incredible how smooth the footage you can get out of something like this compared to shooting handheld. Yeah, I'll have a play around. We've got time at the end. The last thing I have up there, which isn't equipment, well, it's sort of equipment, it's software, and that's editing suites. So most editing software has some sort of digital image stabilization in it as well. What that'll do is it basically tracks what's happening in the video. It'll crop in a little bit so it's got some room to move around, and it'll try and sort of shift the frame to offset your movements as you shake the camera. And these work pretty well. You generally need to use them on something that has a clean background. So if you've got a lot of complex sort of details and textures and lots of subjects moving in and out of frame, it really has a hard time finding what it should track. But if you were shooting something like a talking head where there's just one person sort of standing there and you've got a pretty clean, consistent background, they do an amazing job. I was having a chat with some of the guys at the start about what I use for editing. I use a program called Resolve, DaVinci Resolve, which is free. It's made by Blackmagic. If anyone's familiar with Blackmagic, the camera company, very high-end production level cameras, they have a software called DaVinci Resolve. You can buy it, but you can download a free version, which is probably the most powerful free software I've ever come across in any sort of, whether it's photo editing, document making, anything. It just really blows my mind how good this software is. Can't recommend it enough. Okay, so a little bit about file formats. All right, so there's lots of different numbers and letters and things associated. If you look through your camera menu and you're trying to work out which file settings you should choose, there are more than this list here, but this will be a quick run through of sort of some of the big ones, I suppose. We've got 4K and HD. You've probably heard of either of these terms before. It's to do with the resolution that your camera records, okay? So HD, which is high definition, was the standard until a few years ago, and now 4K is quickly taking over. A couple of years ago, I would have said to people it wasn't really necessary to record in 4K because most display devices, that being computer screens, TV screens, that sort of thing, weren't really displaying 4K yet. But I think you'd be hard pressed to buy a TV these days that didn't play 4K. Computer monitors are still taking a little while to catch up, and the 4K monitors are still quite expensive, but give that another year or two and that'll really change. There are some pros and cons to each. With 4K, you obviously get more resolution, so that's bigger file size. The problem with bigger file size is that it's harder to manage those files. I shot a job for someone a couple of weeks ago, which was a 2-hour performance, and I ended up with 60 gigabytes worth of video footage shooting 4K. And after I shot it, I thought, how am I going to get this to the artist now? I ended up having to actually meet up with them for a coffee and give them the files on their hard drive. It was too big to upload to the cloud like I'd normally do if I was shooting something that was a bit smaller in size. So you've got to be aware of that. You also need a much more powerful computer to shoot 4K as well, because if you try and edit 4K in a middle of the range computer, it's going to split the dummy. It just can't handle it. Whereas HD is much more manageable. Pretty much any medium sort of quality computer would be able to edit HD files. You wouldn't really have any problems with them, and they're relatively small in file size. 4K files are about 4 times bigger. Next one is frame rates. So frame rates is, where you see FPS, so frames per second. There are some common ones like 24, 25, 30 frames per second. But before I get into that, there's 2 kind of frame rates we talk about. First one is your project frame rate, and the second one is your shooting frame rate. So the project frame rate is the frame rate that you're editing your video in, okay, and what you're wanting to output it as. Generally 24, 25 or 30 frames a second, all very common frame rates for sort of natural cinematic looking footage, okay? There are some exceptions to that, but if you go and see a movie in the cinemas, you're probably watching it at 25 frames a second in Australia, 24 frames a second if you're in the States. Now, where does difference between the shooting frame rate and the project frame rate? Well, your shooting frame rate might be 25 frames per second, could be 30 frames per second, could be 60 frames or 120 frames or 240 frames a second if you're wanting to do slow-mo. Because what happens if you've shot at 240 frames per second as your shooting frame rate and then you put it into a project of 25 frames a second, those frames get stretched out. So all of a sudden, rather than having 1 second's worth of footage, you've got, I'm not going to even bother doing the maths, 5 seconds worth of footage or something like that. And that's how slow-mo is created, by shooting at these very high frame rates and then playing them back at a slower frame rate. There is a trade-off to shooting at those very high frame rates. So if you get things like 120 frames or 240 frames per second on your camera, then you're probably going to be shooting at a lower resolution. Not many cameras will let you shoot that super slow-mo at 4K. You'll probably be shooting at HD, maybe even standard definition. No, on my camera, if I want to do 120 frames per second, I've got to shoot at standard definition. I can't even do high definition. So you've got to keep that in mind too. And that's because you're recording more data. When you're recording more data, the camera's going to make it easier for itself. Speaking of data, we've got two terms there, bit rates and bit depths. Bit rate refers to the amount of information that is recorded to the file per second, and general sort of rule of thumb with this is that the higher the number, the better quality the video will be. So try and choose the highest bit rate that you can. It's normally, oh geez, I'm having a mind blank. It's normally Mbps, I think, when you look at it on your video file format, but I am forgetting what the actual acronym is for it. Megabits per second, yeah, Mbps. Bit depth is your color data, okay? So the higher the bit depth, the more colors that your camera is recording. Most cameras, especially sort of this sort of level of camera, record at 8-bit, which is the same sort of color definition you'll get out of a JPEG image. But quite a few of the higher end video cameras, like your Panasonic GH5s, are recording at 10-bit internally. Or you can put something on like a external recorder, like I've got a Shogun on this camera up here, which is an external recorder by Atomos, which will actually take a live feed from the camera's sensor and record at those higher color bit rates, like color bit depths, like 10-bit. I've had problems before when I've been shooting videos in galleries on 8-bit, where you've got these very clean white walls, and then when you try and edit them, what happens is there's not enough color data in those tones of gray, and you get something called banding, which is when you have sort of strips of gray rather than smooth transitions, and it's real pain. You can't really get rid of it. You can try and diminish it, but it's very, very tough. Okay, so now just talking about camera settings a little bit and talking about exposure. So unfortunately, video is a little bit more difficult than stills, and it's not recommended to shoot video in auto exposure. And that's because if you're shooting video in auto exposure and you've got things walking in and out of the frame, or if you're moving the camera around, what'll happen is the camera is going to be making things brighter or darker. And it gives it a bit of like a pulsating effect as it goes brighter than darker, and it's a bit disorientating to watch. So generally you want to choose the exposure yourself. Now it starts with your shutter speed, all right? And there's another rule of thumb I'm going to tell you, and that's to have your shutter speed set to twice your frames per second. So if you're shooting at 25 frames per second, have a shutter speed of a 50th of a second, all right? And this is something that just gives you a very natural cinematic look. Again, you can sort of go veer off this for different sort of creative effects, but it's a good rule of thumb and it's good for just general sort of video shooting. After you've chosen your shutter speed, that's when you want to go to aperture. And you just choose your aperture based on the creative look that you're wanting to get in the shot, okay? So aperture controls how much blur we get in the background. If I want a really shallow depth of field, I want my subject to be nice and crisp, but the background to be blurry, I'll choose a large aperture. And the opposite, choose a small aperture if you're wanting everything to be nice and sharp. The last thing is ISO, and you just choose your ISO based off what your aperture and shutter speed settings are, okay? So that's the last thing. You don't normally think about it too much as a creative choice. I just choose what I need to in order to get a good exposure. Sometimes a problem you'll have if you're shooting video and it's bright and sunny outside and you're trying to shoot with a very large aperture to get that shallow depth of field, you actually won't be able to get your ISO low enough in order to, yep?
Sorry. F14, everything will be in focus. F4,
yep,
you get a shallow.
That's
so
right.
Is F4, you're considering the terminology, that's a higher?
That's a large aperture.
That's a large.
Yeah, a physically large hole.
Right, good.
That's right. That's where it's confusing. Yeah, talking about the size of the hole, not the actual number itself. Yep. For those, good question though. For those who are interested, apertures are actually fractions. So when you see the value 16, it's actually f over 16. And it's actually a small number you're seeing, even though it's normally just says the number 16 as itself. No, that's all right. So ISO, just choose it based on whatever you need, but Sometimes you can't get that low enough if you've got a very large aperture and the whole thing will be overexposed. A lot of videographers will use neutral density filters, which are a dark filter you put over the front of your lens, and that limits the amount of light that comes through. So you can shoot with large apertures and shallow depths of field, even when it's bright and sunny outside. There are a couple of tools to help you with your exposure. Not all cameras have these, but some of particularly the new mirrorless ones do. Camcorders have them as well. This one's called zebraing. So what the camera is doing now is it's putting a stripe over the bits where I've blown out my highlights. And it's there as a warning to say, hey, you know, if I was trying to video someone and it was over their face, I probably want to adjust my exposure because I'm just going to get a face that's pure white. If you can turn this on your camera, it's quite useful. The other thing is your histogram, so you might be able to see there, I've got my histogram displayed in the bottom right hand side too. This is a nice visual indicator for your exposure as well. When you're touching either side, you've lost data. Touching the left hand side, you've reached pure black. Touching the right hand side, you've reached pure white. So you want to make sure that you're not touching either sides. It's what we call clipping when it comes to video data. If sometimes you'll be filming a scene and you will clip things, so maybe the sky will be too bright or the clouds will be too bright, but it's more in terms of how your subject's exposed. You want to make sure that your subject still has color data. You're not losing data there. All right, so we've got exposure. Next thing is focus. And again, typically we need to take more control with focus when it comes to video. You can use autofocus, and what video cameras do when they're focusing is use a system called continuous autofocus, where it's always updating. So as the subject moves forwards or backwards, the camera is going to adjust focus to that as well. The problem you get with continuous autofocus, and I see this all the time when I'm watching YouTube, is that if the camera loses focus, it does this thing where it's called hunting. And it'll go in and out of focus like this, trying to pick up the focus again. It drives me absolutely bonkers when I see it on YouTube, and I find it super, super disorientating. So what a lot of videographers will do is shoot manual focus, all right? Which sounds super scary, right? To start with, to actually control the focus yourself, but you do get a feel for it after a while. And again, there are some tools that can help you manually focus and get it consistently. The easiest way to use manual focus, and what I often do when I'm shooting video, is just to make sure that you're always the same distance from your subject. So if your subject's moving and you start the frame a meter away from them, keep within that meter and follow them around, all right? Don't try and do any fancy zooms or pans or anything like that. But it does take a little bit of practice, and it's obviously you can't always keep the same distance. Sometimes your subject's moving in and out of frame. Again, it's not a foolproof sort of thing to do. Just to sort of skip ahead, I suppose, rack focus is a term used when things go in and out of focus within a scene. It's often used in films where you might have focus on a character in the background and then the focus changes to reveal a detail. I was watching James Bond the other night and they had a shot where they had James Bond in focus. I don't know if anyone's seen Casino Royale. I won't spoil it for you, I guess. Or maybe I will, because I'm going to keep going with this story. But he's sitting at I can't remember, I think it's poker table, and his drink gets spiked. And the focus goes from him to the drink. So immediately what the director's doing is drawing our attention, linking between these two things and saying, okay, this is the connection. James Bond isn't feeling so good, it's probably the drink. It's all done through focus. People often use this in films because it's much easier to do that than it is to set up two different shots. You can shoot the whole thing in one take. And we call that rack focus or pulling focus. Now, as far as focus tools go, this is called focus peaking. This is another thing that a lot of modern cameras do. It's where it puts a red outline or a different colored outline around the bits that are in focus in your scene. It's based off contrast, so the idea being that when you've got something sharp, you've got a higher level of contrast between that pixel and the pixel next to it. So it's not a foolproof way of gauging focus, but it does help quite a bit. The other thing to use is an external monitor. So I don't know how many of you can see this down there, but this big monitor here, these are amazing for doing manual focus. I still remember the first time I used one of these on a job, and it blew my mind how easy it was to manual focus with this thing. And that's because when you go from a screen that's this big, it's very hard to actually see what's sharp. Start looking at a screen this big, all of a sudden you can see all those details you couldn't see before. Obviously it makes it a bit more cumbersome to carry around. You can use them handheld, but you've got to have things like cages which go around the camera in order to support them. They're easiest to be used on top of a tripod. Okay, so last thing I wanted to talk about is framing. Now, this is not an exhaustive list of the kind of framing that you can do to shoot your shots, but it doesn't really matter if you're shooting a film, if you're shooting your kids playing sport, if you're shooting a documentary. By having different frames and using different elements within your scene, you can start to stitch them together to create a story. Right? It's very easy just to set your camera up and shoot the same thing without doing anything, but it's not super interesting shooting that way. Okay, so I call this series Lonely Boy on the Roof. Possibly lonely because no one else was with him to take the photo, so he had to keep using the self-timer and running back and forth. We've got our first shot here, which is called a wide shot, all right? Now, wide shots are used normally to create a sense of grandeur, to show a scene that a subject's sitting in, and to give a sense of them their place within the world, okay? Next one along is called a full shot. And full shots are used to have a bit more of a connection with the subject, but still show them within their environment, okay? Generally, a full shot is considered when you're sort of filling the frame with their feet and from their feet to their head. Then you've got medium shot, still up there wondering why he has no friends, this poor lonely boy. Medium shot is generally from the waist to the head. So when you start to get to this distance, you start to notice expressions a little bit more. You can create more of an emotional connection with the subject, but again, you're still showing a bit of the environment around them. Next one along, we call this one the medium close-up. Medium close-ups are good for starting to gauge emotions and subtleties. So looking at details, looking at performances, changes in expression, changes in face. I also think of this as like the conversational distance as well. So you often see this type of shot when you're looking at conversations in movies where it's going from one person to the other, because it feels sort of like the distance you'd be standing away from some person if you were having a chat with them on the street. And last but not least, the close-up. All right, so close-ups start to get quite intimate. Believe it or not, this is just how my face normally looks when I'm relaxed, which sort of freaks me out seeing it up there this big on screen. But when you start to get close-ups, you can see all the details in someone's face. So they use these often to show really an actor's subtleties in their performance. When you're watching films, you can see the twitch of the eye, you can see the quiver of the lip, and these are nice for showing other details as well. So you can imagine like things I like to do when I'm shooting. If I was shooting someone playing footy, I'd take some videos of them with the footy, but I might also do close-ups of like the grass on the ground, or if there's rain falling, something else. So there's little details in the scenes just to sort of tie the narrative together as to what the actual event is that I'm trying to record. All right, so we're almost done with the 40 minutes. What I'm going to do is just quickly get out of here and show you just a video that I shot of an exhibition I had at the start of the year, just to walk you through what some of these different shot types are. All right, so this shot here, we call this an establishing shot. And it's a wide angle. Oh, I want to go back a bit more. There. So these are used to convey the thing in its entirety, all right? This was an exhibition that had a number of chemigrams in it. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the chemigram process, but they're made using analog paper and messing with the chemistry. And so the first shot conveys the sense of the exhibition in its entirety as it stands, and it's the view that you would see when you first came into the gallery and walked around the wall. What I'm trying to do here is create a narrative around the show for people who weren't able to go see it or to use in future proposals, exhibitions, that sort of thing. So we go from the wide shot, and then we start to get what I would call maybe a medium shot, medium close-up, and then a close-up to finish it off, all right? Now we can start to see some of the detail about what these things actually are. Throw a bit of movement in there. I was there flapping some paper to get these to move. The reason I wanted to show that was that they actually sat off the wall a little bit. So that was a rack focus there. And that one's important because what I'm trying to show here is that the works actually have a sculptural form to them. They're not flat two-dimensional prints, they've got a three-dimensionality. And so I go from the back to the front in order to really emphasize the fact that they're sitting off the wall just by those single pins. A few more close-ups, and then it finishes off with a small zoom outwards, all right, just to sort of end the scene. Okay? And I love doing this sort of work because it's like, how can you video something that's still and make that interesting? I find that's a really nice challenge. But anyway, thanks for hanging around. We're out of time now. If you have any questions, you're welcome to stay back and have a chat with me. We've only really scratched the surface of what video can do. So if you feel like you're wanting to learn more, come along to the Understanding Your Camera video class. As I said, Jade will be at the back of the room taking bookings for that if you would like to join up. But I'll also put the phone number back up here as well. So if you SMS that number, we'll send you out a link and you can use that link in order to book through to that class. But it's only valid until 2 o'clock tomorrow, so get onto it quick. All right, thanks for coming.